More than half a century has passed since the last new Riley car drove with its proud owner out of the showroom. But the memory of Riley and the wonderful cars that that company made remains in the hearts of enthusiasts throughout the world. They are lucky indeed that their bookshelves can groan under the weight of all the books which have been written about the history of the Riley Company and its cars. But today, I'm very lucky to be able to sit in conversation with Victor Riley, who was at the heart of the Riley family and remembers the people who made the Riley name great around the dinner table and with his parents who were themselves fine Riley competitors. So I'm going to have just a few words to say with Victor about his personal reminiscences. Much is written about the history of the cars and their competition exploits, but the heart of the family has often been overlooked. And Victor is here today to be able to tell us something about the people he knew when he was growing up and the stories of the legends of the Riley marque. Victor, can you remember the very first time that you were connected with a Riley motor car?
Yes, my earliest Riley recollection would have been about 1937 when I was 2, and I can remember an Autovia parked outside the house with a chauffeur. And this Autovia was owned by my mother, and although she wouldn't have been very keen to have a chauffeur, Riley's offered, with the sale of an Autovia, the use of a chauffeur, and they even had a course to train chauffeurs so they could offer them when selling an Autovia, because they thought the person buying an Autovia would want a chauffeur. Then if I move on, the next recollection would have been sitting on my father's lap, steering an Adelphi, but just before the war, my father operating the pedals, no traffic in those days in Cotswold lanes, and that was quite exciting, and I can remember that still quite vividly. Then I'll always remember Chamberlain's speech on the outbreak of war. We were on holiday in Bournemouth, and my father was gone within half an hour of the speech, packed a bag, jumped in his Adelphi and roared off to Coventry. And in fact, we didn't see him again for a few weeks. And after the war, he told me he had a bed in his office in Coventry so that he could stay. So that takes us into the war. There were two quite probably miraculous escapes he had in the early part of the war. One was after the Blitz. One of the bombs had a delayed fuse and it pierced the shop floor. And so the following morning, specialists came, extracted the bomb, put it on a lorry, and my father followed the lorry out to the outskirts of Coventry. They unloaded the bomb, had just turned and was setting off back to the works when it exploded. And he always reckoned he'd been quite fortunate on that occasion. And then another occasion was he used to go to a cafe in Kenilworth called the Teapot. He'd have a cup of tea and then go and see his father in Kenilworth before setting off for Stow-on-the-Wold, where he'd moved to. And a bomb went through that cafe soon after he left to go and see his father. I suppose the next vivid occasion is August 1945, between the dropping of the two atomic bombs. Father, and it was school holidays and I was allowed to stay up, and suddenly I looked out of the window and there came this beautiful, elegant, sporting sleek lined car, not the Adelphi, and I ran out of the house, and my father said to me, "You mustn't tell a soul you've seen this when you go back to school, but this is the new Riley, which when the war ends, we shall announce fairly quickly." And to me it was stunning, absolutely stunning. And that takes us to that point.
I was going to say, Victor, that the outbreak of the war probably is a marker for the end of the golden age of the Riley Company as an independent company.
Yes.
And of course the interwar years, the perfect period for vintage motoring as we would now regard it,
Yes.
with those lovely innovative cars, as old as the industry, as modern as the hour.
Yes.
Now, your memories begin, I suppose, at the end of that golden period.
Yeah.
But your parents must have told you much of their own experience. Both of them had been competition drivers.
Yes.
They were in different eras.
Yes.
Can you tell me something about your parents as you recall them now?
Yes. My father was a very early member of the Midland Automobile Club and competed in Shelsley Walsh in sort of 1909, 10, 11 era. And I got a feeling he won the award one year at Shelsley Walsh. Another story he told me, which as a boy used to make me laugh. He and Uncle Alan, the second brother, were both keen cricketers, although the bicycle boom swept that away. But they were invited out to south of Dublin to some huge landed estate to play a cricket match. So they went over in a tricar, and after the match they thought, what a wonderful opportunity to explore Southern Ireland. So off they set. Well, of course, they entered villages which had never seen an internal combustion engine or anything like this on wheels, with one of them sitting in the basket at the front and the other one riding it as if it was a bicycle. And so they'd enter a village, and the children would initially disappear indoors rapidly, quite perhaps frightened. And then a few minutes later, the doors would open and children would gingerly emerge, and then occasionally one would touch a hot spot, and then, of course, they'd go screaming back indoors, shouting, "The devil's here, the devil's here," and then their parents would come out, and my father and Alan had to beat a hasty retreat because the parents didn't look too happy. If I go to Mother now, I suppose the most vivid story with her would be Le Mans 1934, and her inclusion in the Riley six-car team caused a lot of controversy within the company that Rupert Riley, no relation, except possibly very distant, had chosen her to come into the team with only rally driving experience. And a lot of people in the company were astonished at such a choice and were quite critical. But Mother certainly repaid Rupert Riley's faith, and she used to describe to me how on the way to Le Mans they had 2 weeks at Brooklands, tuning and testing, then on to Le Mans with 2 weeks there, and she was telling me how she was woken every night at 1 a.m, taken down to Le Mans, and then did 2 hours driving on the track, because Rupert Riley wanted her to have an experience of hitting a bank of fog at the end of the Mulsanne Straight, which was a very known hazard. Didn't get it every night, but he wanted her to be well aware of what it was like hitting a bank of fog. And so she got used to that. And then on the day of the race, she was very concerned because my father hadn't arrived. And so she ran across the tarmac, possibly not concentrating, possibly thinking of my father, jumped in, shut the door on her fingers. So the first hour, there was blood everywhere, gloves were messed up, shoes were messed up. So in the end, she was last at that stage, 43rd, and the pits called her in, and they cleaned up the cockpit, gave her new gloves, new shoes, and just at that moment my father arrived, gave her a sprig of white heather. That settled her down, and off she roared. Well, by nightfall, she was up to 13th, and the pits sort of very anxiously told her to stop where she was. And again, she told me after my father had died, she was very upset but had to do what she was told. But she said, I'm sure I could have climbed even higher. And so that was a recollection. And of course, then she went on to say about how upset she'd been to have to agree to know motorsport.
That was an imposition from
My
your father after they were married.
yes, yes, yes. There was one exception, in inverted commas, I think, and that was Raymond Bays, who I wasn't told by my mother, but associates of my father told me that Raymond Bays was quite keen on my mother, and he rang her up when she was pregnant with me and said he'd got the new car finished, which was the ERA prototype, but if my father had had his way but something went wrong with the agreement, there were meant to be two teams built, ERA and Riley, and it makes me think my father was also keen to get into what we today call Formula One with a Riley team as well as the ERA team. Anyway, my mother went over to Bourne and test drove the ERA prototype round the Bourne track. Father gets home at 7 in the evening, no sign of Dorothy, and can't understand where she's gone and what's happening. She returns about between 10 and 11 at night. He gets quite worked up about it, and but it made me always think that I could have been born in an ERA because I was born a month later. So that always tickles me to death. But that was the only exception, I think, in her married life where she broke away.
She had begun her motoring career competitively with a Riley, hadn't she?
Yes.
She'd always wanted one, but she didn't have the means at the beginning, did she, to acquire one?
No, and there's a good story there. While she was still at school, Riley Motor Club came in their early days after formation to Scarborough, thinking that was a good potential marketplace with the people who lived in Scarborough. And there was a rally there, and my mother's godparents had a Riley and introduced her to my father, who in those days went to all the rallies. And so when 2 or 3 years after leaving school, and she was doing nursing, her uncle died, who left her £1,000, but subject to conditions such as nursing, secretarial work, but of course no mention of motorsport. And so she remembered meeting my father, wrote to him to see if he could help break the will's provisions. And my father took her to a London solicitor, and somehow or other they found a way to break the provision, and she got the £1,000 and spent roughly £300 of it to buy a Riley 9. Then she started rally driving and started to win trophies galore, which brought her to the attention of the Riley Company. And gradually she was assisted with works provided cars, culminating in the final accolade of an imp at Le Mans in 1934.
And having distinguished herself in 1934 as I think the fastest lady at Le Mans ever up to that point, the first thing she did after the checkered flag fell was to register for the following year's Le Mans in 35.
Yes.
But sadly the
Yes.
imposition of the prohibition from your father
Yes.
prevented that.
Yes. I went back in a retro Le Mans when I went out with Graham White and his Sprite, no, his Brooklands, and went in the pits. And I broke away for an hour or two and went into the adjacent museum and library at the Le Mans track and introduced myself, and I got an enormous reception, and they got out a huge photograph album full of photographs of my mother, and I said, does her record still stand? And they said, yes, yes it does. And so that was quite exciting to learn.
It must have been such a wrench for her to
Yeah.
relinquish something that she loved so much.
Yes.
But that was your father's view.
Yes.
Tell me something about your father. What kind of a person was he?
Very fair-minded. I always remember if there was a disagreement, his conversation, I thought, always put both sides to the argument, as if he was weighing up as he spoke the way to go. But then later on, I think this was maybe after he died, I discovered that in the detachable Wow Wheel saga, when there were three companies fighting continually over patents, Rudd Whitworth, Goodyear and Riley, and cases, or one particular case, Riley's lost at every stage, and then grandfather called a halt. But my father still felt Riley's had a strong case. And so he said to his father, I'm going to appeal to the House of Lords. My father said, we can't afford that sort of legal representation. Don't worry, I'm going to represent myself. And grandfather said to him, well, you've got no experience. Well, I'm going to do it. And he did it, and he won the case in the House of Lords. And when they passed judgment, they said to him, if you hadn't been a car manufacturer, you would have made a very fine barrister. And that rather chimed with the way he put things to me when there was a disagreement within the family. Very fair-minded, I think.
It may be worth mentioning just at this point that the Riley name is not, as many people have supposed, from Ireland, but you are a Warwickshire family, through and through.
Yes, and that's thanks to Mike Riley, a very distant cousin who comes off a sort of parallel line, and he and I have done research probably for at least 20 years now, and although David Stiles' book said we came from Ireland, we've now established the genealogical tree back to Queen Elizabeth I's reign, when we were butchers and woolen weavers, and we've traced it all the way through, and we can see where David Stiles took a wrong turn, which is so easy to do in genealogy. And the person he said had a son. In fact, we've been over to Lichfield Cathedral, because in those days the church held all the wills, and found that that person had no children. And so we can see where the mistake was made, and we're happy now that we are a Warwickshire family. And
I think there is also a suggestion from the researches which have been done that a rather distinguished person became connected to the family in earlier times.
Yes, what happened, and this is where David Stiles may have got encouraged with an Irish assumption. There was a family in Ireland who came across to Liverpool in the potato famine, went north to Manchester, and had 5 children, having brought a 2-year-old daughter with them. One of those 5 came south to Coventry, having changed the spelling from O apostrophe R-E-I-L-L-Y to R-I-L-E-Y because of the anti-Irish nature of the riots in Manchester, sets up as a tailor in Coventry and scoops all the clothing contract with the Coventry Cycling Club, which was a very big contract in those days, with jackets and +4s and headgear and gloves and so on, and then marries grandfather's younger sister. And so that is an Irish connection, but not a direct line.
At the heart of the Warwickshire connection, though, there is a suggestion that the family was connected to William Shakespeare.
Yes. Research that's been done said that way back in Shakespeare's time, Queen Elizabeth I's reign, the two families intermarried. And I always remember disclosing this in my speech at the Riley Archive fundraising lunch hosted by the Lord Mayor in June 2019, this fact, and I sort of capped it by saying, sort of poetry in motion, that we could have a bit of Shakespeare in the Riley Nine and a bit of Riley Nine in a Shakespeare comedy or tragedy or so on. But there is another aspect to this, is that Francis Riley, who was a descendant of what I've just disclosed by this immigrant from Ireland in the potato famine, she goes back in the 1930s to Ireland and goes round all the churches in Southern Ireland and traces the family I've described as coming over back to the Black Prince campaigning in Ireland, having an affair with a local girl, and Frances reckoned she could trace the whole family tree over hundreds of years to herself. Sadly, the Coventry solicitors, Band Hatton, couldn't find the family tree which she'd lodged with them before she died, and I pestered them, but they said they couldn't find it. But I felt that would have been such a piece of history. But there we are.
At any rate, the family was well established in the heart of the Midlands in the end of the Victorian era, which is when I suppose the origins of your story really begin, with your grandfather William and his sons Percy, Stanley, Cecil and Alan, and of course your father Victor. William was originally involved not in motor cars or even bicycles, but in weaving, wasn't he?
Yes, he was in weaving, and his father, my great-grandfather, handed over to him when he was only 19 in 1870, because he pleaded ill health. Although as he lived into his 80s, I've always wondered whether he was perhaps just not interested in business and weaving and so on. He possibly detected in his son some innovation and desire to work and so on. Grandfather had a flying start because 1870 was the Franco-Prussian War, and so imports from the continent stopped. So he had 2 very good years building up outliers who would come into his warehouse with their goods on a Friday or Saturday, and then come back on Monday to collect the raw material for the next week's work. Now this sounds so obvious, you think, well, why on earth wasn't this done a long time ago? William, because the women said to him, their menfolk came home twice drunk first on a Friday or Saturday night and then again on a Monday night. Could he do anything about it? And he said, yes, I'll give them the raw material when they bring their finished goods in. So you've only got one drunk night. And so he did that. And of course the women were absolutely delighted. So he sort of made a name with them. And the pub by his warehouse, the Admiral Codrington, still stands to this day. And in fact, we've now set up a Riley archive only 50 yards away. So we're now back where our roots are. But that is always a fascinating story to me. Something so obvious, never done. But I suppose it proves that no one likes change.
But of course, change did come for the Coventry weavers, didn't it? There was a collapse in the industry.
Yes.
And so your grandfather had to think where he would take his company from there.
Yes.
And the bicycle boom
Yes.
was taking off.
Yes. Yes. I mean, father was in school at the age of 12, and my father always described Black Monday to me, and I've tried, thinking this would be a headline in the Coventry Evening Telegraph, I've tried to find the edition which presumably would have had it as headlines, but I haven't been able to find it yet, but I haven't given up. And the teacher said to my father, you've got to go, get the pony and trap and go and collect your father. All the Coventry weavers have gone under because of the cheaper imports. Because the continental weavers were involving looms and, if you like, getting mechanised, whereas Coventry weavers stayed as craftsmen, and so their prices were much higher. So father goes and collects his father, and by then grandfather was getting to know Henry Sturmey, who became the first editor of Autocar in 1895, and he said to William, my grandfather, get into bicycles as fast as you can. There's a boom like no other boom we've ever had. So grandfather said to father, I'm putting you into Bonwick, learn how to make a bicycle quickly. That's what we've got to do. And so that was done. Bonwick had a very sad episode. They had a huge export order for Bonwick bicycles from America, which they shipped out. Then the American importer went bust, so Bonwick couldn't get their money. And although they went to court in America, the Americans rather looked after their own, I think, and they never got paid. Bonwick then got into difficulty. Grandfather swooped and got them on the cheap, and then renamed Bonwick Riley Cycle Company Limited in 1896 when the company was formed.
And so bicycle wheels and then later car wheels were much in evidence in the manufacturing in the Riley company at that time.
Yes, and in fact Riley had orders from 183 manufacturers spread all over the world, and it was so profitable that although Percy, Allen and father had started to make engines which were then put on to Riley bicycles to make motor bicycles, and then a third wheel was added to make the tricar, grandfather still objected and wanted nothing to do with the internal combustion engine. So he said to his sons, look, I can make more money from detachable wire wheels than we can from tricars, so I am sticking with detachable wire wheels and I'm dropping tricars. So the three elder brothers then formed Riley Manufacturing Company in Widdrington Avenue and broke away. And at the Olympia show in 1913, before World War I, there were two Riley stands, one with the detachable wire wheels and one with the tri-cars. But then World War One came and swept everything away, and Riley's never went back to detachable wire wheels.
You must have been so proud of the brothers, because each of them, in their own way, contributed hugely to the energy and the impetus to improve engineering during the 1920s particularly. Percy, of course, and at the age of 18, having built his own motor car at the end of the 19th century. Sadly, he died in 1941, but do you have any recollection of Percy, whose famous Riley engine remains to this day one of the most innovative ever conceived in this country?
Yes, I do. We used to go quite frequently for Sunday afternoon tea with grandfather in Kenilworth, and every now and again Percy and Nora, who became my godmother, were there. And the one thing that Percy used to say again and again to my father, if they were discussing something, was, "It's not a proper job, Victor. If you want me to, I'll turn it into a proper job." And my father said, "Well, yes, you do that." But it was that saying. It was either a proper job or not a proper job. There was no argument about it. He could always see the way to improve. That's my memory. And also stories like, if there was a complaint from a customer, the first thing he would do was go charging into the Riley buying office, checking whether or not they'd cheapened his specification. And often he'd find they'd dropped the EN specification on the steel to a cheaper steel, and he'd reprimand them. He said, "We're making a quality car. You must not cheapen what I specify." That was another story that I used to hear quite often.
I think you've said that he was particularly noted for his singleness of purpose. He would concentrate on one job and see it through from beginning to end, rather than being diverted into other projects.
Yes, that happened, and particularly with the Brooklands. Parry Thomas very quickly spotted that the Riley 9 could be exploited to produce a racing car engine, and he thought the potential was enormous, and he buttonholed my father and said, "This engine, it can do much more. Will you let me go to work on it down at Brooklands?" And my father said yes. So Parry Thomas came along to Percy and said, I need a chassis and an engine, and Percy was so busy with the first round of improvements to the 9, and the demand so overwhelmed the works. My father had the agonising decision of whether to drop the side valve, which was already doing well at Brooklands with Ashby and people, but in the end he had to drop it to allow capacity for the extra production of the Riley 9. But Percy said to Parry Thomas very politely, "I'm too busy at the moment. If you will just be patient, we'll help you, but not just yet." But Parry Thomas was in a hurry, and of course sadly he was to die before he finished his drawings, but Reed Relton, looking over his shoulder, was able to carry on. But Parry Thomas, in the end, went back to my father and Gordon Marshall, who was a senior executive in Riley's, and somehow or another they got a chassis, into Parry Thomas's hands, and a Riley 9 engine. Not quite sure how that was done, but and of course Parry Thomas got cracking, and the rest, as they say, is history with the Riley Brooklands model.
It's an irony, isn't it, that Percy was never active in motorsport and in fact rather shied away from it because of his fear that people might die in his motor cars, and he didn't want that.
No, no, he was very, very specific. He said to my father, if ever a Riley driver in a race gets killed, I shall walk away from having anything to do with Riley racing cars. But fortunately, that never happened, but it came extremely close in one of the TTs in Northern Ireland, where I think Jack Chambers, driving a Riley Brooklands, went off the track and killed, I think it was 7 or 8, maybe 12 people, and injured a lot more, although he himself survived. But that upset Percy badly, but it hadn't quite broken his pledge about a Riley driver.
And that accident, in fact, saw the end of the Ards TT as an event.
Yes.
Stanley had also been a competitive driver in the early days with your father.
Yes.
What can you recall much of your life with Stanley?
Not so much with him, but I do remember my father telling me how in the early days, sort of 1910-ish, he entered a Scottish rally with one of the first Riley 9s, and was the only driver ever to complete a Scottish rally over 3 days without losing a single penalty point. So he won the rally handsomely, and I remember that being told to me as a boy by him. But the area where I got to know him much better was in the school holidays. Mother and father used to invite the surviving brothers over for Sunday lunch, and those lunches I looked forward to every school holidays, because I used to listen, hardly saying a word, to a lot of the old stories as they reminisced. And then as I got older, I announced that I wanted to go to the moon one day, and the 4 elder brothers, well the 3 because Percy had died, all said to me, no, it's in the Bible, we shall never leave, I think the phrase was, the girdles of the earth. And although I've never found that sentence in the Bible when I searched as a boy, but William Thomas Cecil, the youngest of the 5 brothers, whom we known as Uncle Tet, he took my side and he said, we won't live to see it, but Victor will live to see it. We will get to the moon. And it was at the stage where the German V2 rocket expert, Werner Braun, had published a book in America, because the Americans took him away to America at the end of the war. And of course, I think he played a big part in the American moon mission. And he wrote a book illustrated with photographs of all the planets and so on. And my Aunt Billy, Uncle Tet's wife, gave it to me for a Christmas present, and that's what stimulated my thinking. Yes.
Cecil, whom you've mentioned, known as Uncle Tet,
Yeah.
was the real adventurer of the family, wasn't he?
He had the most amazing life. He joined up, well, all 5 brothers went to the Lord Mayor's office on day 1 of World War One. The Lord Mayor only kept Cecil. The other 4 were told to get back to their workplaces and make munitions. But within 3 weeks, and I just can't explain this to myself, Uncle Tet was in a trench out in France, and I asked myself, what training could he have had? Um, and then it wasn't too long before they asked for volunteers to ride motorbikes up and down the lines with messages. And he decided he'd be safer there. So he applied and was given the job. And then the German snipers got better and better, and he suddenly realised that he was at risk on his motorbike. And amazingly, there's a book being written, which I'm trying to trace, by one of those motorbike riders. There must have been a team of them, and I believe Uncle Ted is mentioned. There must have been a small band of them, and probably grew very close to each other. But anyway, they then asked for volunteers to form the Royal Flying Corps. So Cecil thought he'd be safer up in the sky. So up he volunteered and came sent back to Castle Bromwich, where he was trained, and then went to Turnhill in Shropshire, where he was learnt to combat flying. Although he told me that in the early days they had a revolver to try and shoot down the opposing flyer from the enemy side. And I just cannot see you ever hitting the opposing flyer with a revolver. But he said that's what we were taught. And then, of course, he had a crash and was in hospital for about 9 months. And father and grandfather went to see him every day as they pieced him together. And then he rejoined the company. But he always said to me he felt a little bit miffed because all the good jobs were taken by his 4 elder brothers. So my father shunted him around from job to job, and including sales manager. But then when the Riley Motor Club was formed, he really came into his own, because my father made him the social secretary, the sports secretary, and so he started to plan these big Riley rallies, which he made the base in Wales. So I think the first one was Llangollen, then came Llandudno, which was so successful he went back to Llandudno, the third rally. But I've been up to Llandudno trying to picture it, because there were 500 Rileys down the promenade, and every hotel was booked by Tet, and the Lord Mayor helped him, and it must have been an amazing rally, that. And of course they'd come from all over England and then descended on Llandudno, and then Tet sent them out into Snowdonia and Borchigoes and Hillclimb and so on as further tests before the final results were announced. So Tet just loved that job, because he'd explore Wales, planning the route and so on. And then along comes World War II. He joins up with father pleading with him, saying, look, you've done your bit. World War I. But no, up he went for World War II. First job was being put in charge of the anti-aircraft guns on the Thames estuary. And he got very upset on there, because after the London Blitz, where they dropped bombs on the Butter Mountain on the estuary docks, and of course that just burnt and burnt, and their ack gun breeches got so hot, he had a man badly injured with the breech exploding, so he withdrew all his men for an hour until breeches had cooled, and the Daily Mail had ack gun crews run from their positions, and Tet got on to my father the next morning and said, please, can you get that refuted? It's a disgraceful slur on my men. We had to flee because I'd have lost more men. So that was rather moving. And anyway, then he gets sent out to India, into Burma, and my son-in-law was at York Barracks a few years ago, and invited me to stay the night, and he showed me round. And walking along one of the corridors, I saw a picture of the famous Battle of Kohima, which if we'd lost the Japanese would have poured into India, but fortunately won. And looking at this, reminding me, I said to Robin, I said, Uncle Ted told me when I was a boy, when he was demobbed in 1946, he came and sat on my bed, because I'd been sent to bed when my parents invited him to dinner, and he told me how he borrowed a Caterpillar tractor from the Americans, and he went up the side of a hill, pushing trees to either side. And I said he was followed by one tank, and when they got to the ridge, the tank then, as soon as daylight was getting near, they went along the ridge firing down on the Japanese positions. And I said my son-in-law was absolutely so excited. He said, good Lord, he said, that's probably then your uncle on that Caterpillar. And so that was another amazing story about Uncle Ted. In between the two wars, he'd had another exciting episode in his life. Father said to him that once they got home demand satisfied, because at one stage there were 2-year waiting lists for the Rhine 9, but he said to Tet, I want you to choose a country within the empire, get a job and study terrain, make it as hostile as possible, and then we'll tackle the export markets. So Tet subsequently chose Gold Coast because of the jungle, the temperature, and the proximity to the Sahara Desert. He then organises a motorbike ride to Timbuktu. Again, he told me this story when he was sitting on my bed before dinner, and I said, I thought Timbuktu was a throwaway line. No, he said, in the year 1000 AD, that was the busiest place in Africa. I said, what? Yes, he said, that was the centre of all the caravan routes. They all went through Timbuktu. And so he said, I decided that was where we would go. So off we went with 3 motorbikes. Took us about 6 weeks to get there. But what was incredible, they took a cook with them who, on one of the motorbikes, had a sidecar. And so the cook, she was put in the sidecar with all her utensils to cook them every night a meal. And so that was, and they got there, and it was so hot in the daytime, they went often by night and navigated by the stars. So that was another incredible episode in his life. Which
and then when the Riley 9 first came on the scene, he was the one who was given the task of testing it almost to destruction, I suppose.
Yes.
In Snowdonia and in the Alps.
Yes, and Southern Ireland. A member has been back to Bern in Switzerland and found the restaurant that Uncle Tet used to go, and if he was anywhere near Bern, if he could get there for an evening meal, he'd go there to get a really decent dinner. And he said, Victor, that restaurant's still there. And so that was another interesting link. Yeah.
So through the association with your distinguished uncles and of course your parents, you must have meant in your enthusiasm to discover all sorts of famous drivers of the era. Were you able to pursue that and to encounter them and meet them socially?
Yes. I suppose Freddie Dixon was the most colourful character, who had a penchant for Pimm's, and Jill, Percy's middle daughter, who was 4 or 5 years older than I was, and she got hold of a Brooklands, and she went to Freddie Dixon and took me with him on one occasion in the negotiations and asked him could he find her a Brooklands, which he did. I do remember his colourful language, and also Jill tried to get an appointment with him to do the final transaction, and she had a Vale special when she wanted to move to Brooklands, so she sold the Vale special for about £60, I think, and she needed another 60 to get the 120 that Freddie Dixon wanted. Eventually, she got that money, and we went to collect. She took again with her, which was very exciting for me, and we went to make the appointment and saw his housekeeper. By then, he had a house in Reigate with lots of outbuildings where he did work on people's Rileys, because he'd been banned from driving because the police caught him one night when he'd had too much Pimm's, and that sadly ended his racing career and his driving license. But anyway, the housekeeper said to him, "Look, this can be difficult, and there's no guarantee he'll be fit for when you come, but I'll do my best." Anyway, back we went 2 or 3 weeks later by the appointed time, and we knocked and knocked and knocked and no answer. And Jill said, "Oh dear, this is what the housekeeper warned us about." Anyway, suddenly the housekeeper did open the door, and way behind her we saw a tottering figure, still in his pyjamas and dressing gown, coming towards us. And Jill said, "Oh, Victor, I'm not too sure about this." But eventually the transaction was complete, and off we drove. And Jill breathed a sigh of relief. And now other drivers, I remember George Easton, who broke quite a lot of records in the Riley 9 and 1. He puzzled my father somewhat, because occasionally my father would go to him for the team, and he was driving for someone else, and he was the only driver that did this. But I guess he wanted the money, and so he would be constantly hiring himself out. But my father always had a delightful expression about George Easton, which I didn't appreciate till I was much older, when he said, "You know, Victor, I think his left hand never knew what his right hand was doing." And I puzzled over this, but I guess it was because George Easton had such a complex life, because I think in the end, when he gave up record breaking, he'd driven for 14 different makes over the years, and so I guess life was complicated for him. Ken Peacock was another person, and in the end, I did my apprenticeship and in fact stayed my working life with GKN subsidiaries. Bill Beck, his navigator, a co-driver, I got to know extremely well. And when I was writing the chapters on some of the drivers for the forthcoming Brooklands model book, I always remember going to Cropthorne near Evesham, where Bill Beck, because he changed his name from Von der Beck to Bill Beck as the proximity to war grew, and he thought it was better to get rid of the German link. I always remember driving into Cropthorne and getting out of the car, and there was in the old days, every stretch of road had a sort of road sweeper and verge guardian, and they would go up one stretch, cross over, and down the other side. And Cropthorne still had such a gentleman. And I went over to him, and he said, "Oh yes, I remember Beck. He used to buy us a drink in the pub several nights a month." And I can see him now going off to SO Research, where he worked after he left Riley, and so that was an interesting link.
One of the people who was most well known at the time that your mother was competing was another lady called Kate Peter.
Yes.
Did you ever meet her?
I met her only once, and that was the first London Brighton after the war, 1946, and my father entered in a 1903 tricar, and we were in Hyde Park just before the start, and Kay Peter, who was then correspondent for the Daily Graphic, sadly a paper that no longer exists, and she came to interview him before the start of the race, and sent him a cutting from the Daily Graphic after the race, because he got to Brighton all right. But that was quite interesting.
And she had been the co-driver with your mother in the 34 Le Mans.
Yes, and I think they would have done the same in 1935 if my mother hadn't married. Yes, yeah.
That interwar period was the great era of distinguished lady racing drivers.
Yes.
Who were, to every degree, the equal of their male competitors. Elsie Wisdom, Joan Richmond, two other great names associated with the Riley Company.
Yes, yes. That last couple, when I went out to Riley Motor Club of Australia national annual rallies, I was staying with my cousin Percy's youngest daughter Rosalind in Melbourne, and she said, "Oh, Victor, we've got Joan Richmond living here. You must go and see her," which I did, although it was very sad to me because she was in dire straits, and I was so sad to see how she'd sort of dropped down in life, and I wondered what had gone wrong. But she, when I went and had tea with her, she showed me the gold cigarette case my father had given her after her Brooklands victory with Elsie Wisdom. I think the first lady drivers to win at Brooklands. And she also told me a lovely story. She sent my father a telegram in the middle of the night during a sort of teenage party in Melbourne, asking whether they could have some Rileys to drive over for the Monte Carlo Rally. And when the accountant was shown this telegram by my father, he said to me, you can't let three teenage girls have three Riley 9s. He said, you don't know them. They could crash them all. And my father said, well, I'm rather taken by the application. And so he telegrammed back, take 3 from stock, to which were fitted Australian bodies. And off these 3 young ladies set, reached Sicily just before the start of the Monte Carlo Rally. They entered, came 17th, 18th, 19th, stayed together as a team, and then decided to come to the Riley Coventry Works after the rally to meet my father. Nothing was being done, but thanks to Uncle Tet, who had this roving series of jobs with him, he rushed along to my father and said, "Do you realise publicity coup is looming up?" And my father said, "Well, not really, no." But he said, "Just think, the Australian teenage, we must put on a big reception." And my father said, "Well, all right then." So they put on a big reception. All the brothers turned out to meet them, and so on. And it was a big coup in the papers and magazines. And but Joan Richmond, yes, just sad to see the way her life ended. But quite a lady. Yeah.
Another person, of course, whom you came to know was Lord Nuffield.
Yes. Now their link, he and my father, went way back to the bicycle era. Amazingly, Oxford and Coventry had this very strong bicycle heritage and a lot of bicycle competitions. Nuffield became, when he was still known as William Morris, he became Oxford cycling champion, and my father became Coventry cycling champion. And there was intense rivalry between the two cities with an annual competition. That's when they got to know each other, which is what led to the link, which was re-established in 1938 when Nuffield persuaded my father to come under his umbrella. And I didn't know about my father being Coventry cycling champion till a member, Neville Farquhar, became Coventry cycling champion, and when he was presented with the trophy, he found my father's name on it and rang me up and said, "Your father was Coventry cycling champion." I said, "Well, he never told me about that." Oh, he said, "I suppose he got swept away into cars and forgot about his cycling life." But he said he was cycling champion, and that was how the link was established. Nuffield didn't come to my father's funeral, but weeks after he invited my mother over for tea when I was home one weekend from my apprenticeship, because I tried to get home to see my mother each weekend, and my mother and Lady Nuffield were both very keen gardeners, and so my mother was whisked off to look at the flowers, and Nuffield talked to me, and it was quite interesting what he said. He said, "You know, your father didn't give enough attention to financial and cost control." And he said, "I'll tell you what I did to overcome that, because like your father, I was very keen on the nuts and bolts side, and finance and cost control didn't really interest me. Neither did they. Your father was much more interested in customers, motorsport, using motorsport to increase sales of cars and so on." Now he said, what I did, in the next office to me, I had an accountant, and his job was to look at every purchase invoice before it was paid. And he was only to bother me if there was something he didn't like about the invoice. Otherwise, he was not to bother me. And he said, I always remember one example of this. He said to me one day, "This invoice seems fairly expensive." And he said, "It rang a bell with me. A few weeks earlier, this supplier had taken me out to lunch, which I didn't often agree to, because I didn't want to feel beholden. But I went out with this chap, and we had a couple of bottles of champagne." I said to myself, well, if you can afford champagne, are you charging me too much? So he said, when this accountant mentioned this invoice, it rang a bell. And I said, go back and ask him for a 10% reduction. And a few days later, the accountant said to me, he did it without even demurring. And he said, I realised, yes, he could afford it. And but he said that's what your father, easy to criticise, but that's what he could have done with. And but I always remember that story, and I thought, yes, my father should have done that, because it emerged subsequently, which might have played a part in the subsequent takeover, and that was that the company secretary was found to be embezzling funds, and therefore if my father had taken a greater interest in finance and cost, perhaps that person would have been exposed much earlier.
This was a man called Hester Baker, wasn't it?
Hester Baker, yes. And it's a funny world. An apprentice, years later, whom I used to go and see on the way to to Coventry rallies, and I always used to stop and have a cup of coffee with him at his house in Leamington Spa. He used to visit Hester Baker, and he said, Victor, I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something about him I didn't like. But he said, you know, in life where everything looks tickety-boo, and there's no scientific reason for questioning somebody, but you know the saying, the hair's on the back of your neck? And he said, really, none of us should ever ignore that feeling, even if everything looks perfect. And he said, when this man was exposed, I kicked myself for not having gone to perhaps the apprentice superintendent, although maybe no one would have believed an apprentice, I don't know. But I wished I'd spoken out, even though it might have got me into hot water. Yes, that was...
That's an interesting point, which is rarely known, I think. People ascribe the failure of the company in 1938 to making too many models, and of course the difficulties with Briggs Bodies, who had let down the company so very badly. But that's an interesting aspect, that there was some fraud going on in the background.
Yes, which
from Hester Baker,
which took time. I mean, the Briggs aspect you've touched on, there's no doubt any one of those three aforementioned reasons would have been enough to have saved the company. And possibly a fourth one was, my father criticised himself in the war when he was starting to talk to me as a boy. He said, I could have saved it by putting more of my own money in. But your mother was worried because I'd had a bad ulcer and I nearly died. She was worried she'd be left with two small children and me dead. And so I stopped putting my own money in to stop her worrying. But at his funeral, a business associate said to me, we pleaded with your father to sue Briggs because he would have had enormous damages, because there were hundreds of bodies stacked all over the works. None of them would fit the chassis. And he had plenty of reason. But because he was such a sort of Christian type gentleman, all he did was sort of talk to them and let them have time to modify. But that cost the company dear, and he should never have been so soft with them. Yes, it's, yeah.
And so the company name fell into the Nuffield Empire.
Yes.
And moving then into that post-war era, Victor, which Riley cars did you own and enjoy?
I must just tell you a story before going on to that. In World War II, the second part, BBC were allowed to plant a journalist in the Pathfinder squadron, and the BBC journalist's account of the Pathfinder flight and the dropping of the flares to show the way to the following Lancaster squadrons was broadcast live, and in the middle of it, the journalist said, I mean, I'm on a Pathfinder plane, and my father jumped to his feet and said, that's it. That's the first Riley after the war. What a fantastic model name. And linked to such a brave squadron. And I've never forgotten that. He literally jumped to his feet, and that's how he got so excited. And then, sadly, when the post-war 1.5 was about to be launched, Nuffield persuaded him to hold the name back until the next model. And my father was very upset, saying, but this is the perfect name. But Nuffield said, but we don't know if we're going to upset anyone who lost a beloved one. I think you've just got to be sensitive I know it's such a brilliant name. I know that, and you will use it. I know, but it wasn't till 10 years later, 1955, I think, when the name got used. But my models were the first one was a Riley Sprite, which I just simply adored, uh, um, and then I moved on to my mother's post-war 1.5, which she'd thrashed. In fact, it needed regular attention. And then, of course, I moved into the BMC era, the 1.5, which I rally drove, had a lot of fun in that, and won one of these big Riley 24-hour rallies. And I always remember Bob Porter writing in the Riley Record, "The chip off the old block has emerged." And then I moved on finally to a Riley Elf with a Downton conversion, which I did a lot of rally driving in, and had a lot of fun against Mini Coopers, and the Downton conversion enabled me to keep up with them. And but yes, I've got happy memories of. The only thing I wished, but I again rather like my mother, I allowed myself to promise my father when I started my apprenticeship not to indulge in motorsport. And of course, when I did start 5 years later, I bitterly regretted having agreed with him, and yet I should have realised I was allowing myself to be manipulated like my mother. But to be fair to him, what made an enormous impact on him, and I can still remember Sir William Large's son coming back from Le Mans as a spectator, fell asleep and was killed, and my father was very affected by that, and I'm sure that's what influenced him, wanting me to have nothing to do with getting involved in and running any risk. So once again, like my mother, I agreed. But you know.
And now, of course, Riley has come back to Coventry in an unforeseen way with the
Yes.
Riley Archive
Yes.
Trust, which is
Yes.
now established in a building in the
Yes.
Canal Basin in the
Yes.
heart of Coventry,
Yes.
where the Blue Diamond sign is proudly displayed outside.
Yes, yes, yes. Which is a wonderful feeling, and to think we're within 50 yards of the weaving warehouse, the bicycle works. It's just incredible, and we owe you a vote of thanks for the slogan "Riley returns to Coventry," which is now on our newly designed note paper, and I'm trying to use in speeches around Coventry, which I did only the other night, where I foolishly allowed myself, after the mini fest on the Saturday daytime, there was a pop concert Saturday night, and I allowed James Noble to persuade me to attend it. And in the interval when the pop concert team had a break, he persuaded me to come on stage and talk about Riley's, which Elizabeth, when she heard this, it was furious and said, "You've done a day's work standing and talking. What on earth were you doing going to a pop concert?" I said, "Well, the noise was deafening." She said, "Well, you know what they're like, these modern pop groups."
But Victor, you clearly star wherever you go.
But anyway, yes. But it is wonderful that we're established, and the archive is now nearing its final appearance, with all these images round the walls, and grandfather's up on the wall, and my mother at night in her room on the Mulsanne Strait is up on the wall too. But now, with the opening of the Daimler building last weekend, talks are going to get underway to see that my other aspiration can take place, and that's a space for a dedicated, say, 6 Riley car museum to be set up, which would include the replica and a 1906 early Riley 9, the Pathfinder that was driven all the way from Australia to Coventry, arriving the night before the centenary in 1996, and so on. So that would be really wonderful. But we'll wait and see how the meeting goes.
Let us hope it progresses.
Yes,
But,
yes,
thank
thank
you
you.
so much for giving us your wonderful reminiscences.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much. Yeah.